Welcome to Genesis Part 5. This lesson is about Abraham and his growth in faith and his final test of his faith. And we'll summarize some of these chapters quite briefly. In Genesis chapter 13, Abraham and Lot part ways after they have a dispute over water rights. Read in Genesis chapter 13 that Abraham led Lot to the top of a hill and told him to pick where would he like to go. He had first choice. Remember that Lot is Abraham's nephew. Technically, he could have been the inheritor of Abraham's estates. He could have become the next patriarch because he was a relative that was close and was adopted like a son, almost like a son, because Abraham had taken him under his wing and taken care of him as a young man after his father had passed away. Lot is the son of Haran, which is Abraham's brother. So in chapter 13, they part ways because they have a dispute over water rights for the animals. And Lot does choose the best portion of land in the valley to take as his own for his animals. So Lot is really a minor character. In Genesis 12, we have the call of Abraham. In chapter 13, we have the struggle over land and water with Lot. And Genesis 18, here is Lot again. He is having Abraham intercede for him again for the angels who were planning to go in and destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And was it the end of the world? Probably, just like with the flood story. It's one of those things where it seemed like it was the end of the world because there's not a lot known about the area outside of them. And in Genesis 19, we find out that the ancestors of the Ammonites and Moabites are going to be descended from Lot. In the story of Lot, what we want to do is take a look at the Abraham cycle. 3 stories about Lot's separation from his uncle Abraham. There's first, again, as we said, the land and water rights. Then there was a story of Lot being captured and carried away during a military invasion. So Abraham rounds up 318 people to go after them, and he rescues Lot and brings him back. And then again, Abraham intercedes with the angels in order to save Lot and his family from destruction when the cities are going to be destroyed. So I think what we need to think about is reflect on the character differences of Abraham and Lot. Abraham is acting in faith. That is the focus of this story. It is not Lot who is the focus. It is actually Abraham who is the focus, and it's the character of his faith, not the character of Lot. And the daughters of Lot, they escape from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and are up in the mountains only with their father, whom they think they are the last 3 people on earth. And so they want to preserve Lot's line. And so you can read that story if you haven't already read it, and come to find out then that this is an explanation for the future of the difference between Israel and the two tribes of Moab and Ammon and the other descendants of Lot through his daughters. So the fate of Lot's wife echoes a common motif in some folklore stories. Lot's wife mirrors his Lot himself's indecisiveness, and she lingers to the point of her death. The nature of the cataclysm could explain the salt pillar. She was engulfed in the fallout of fire and chemicals. There are human-shaped pillars of salt that are still found in that area and that may have prompted this element of the story. And what about Lot's daughters? The reference to Moabites and Ammonites may attest to that these people were rarely ever on friendly terms later with Israel. But we need to recall, or we will come across in the future, the knowledge that Ruth was a Moabite. She was a descendant of Moabites, and that is making this son of Lot's daughter an ancestor of both David and Jesus. The Messianic line has one of its roots in this initiative by Lot's daughter. Even out of the worst of family situations, God can bring goodness, life, and blessing to the world. We'll take a look at a little bit of video here. Come to think about whether or not are these people historical figures or are they just stories? Are some parts of their stories are real? Some parts are embellished. What do you think?
Dry, but where the flocks could find shade under the olive trees. Here, in a place called Shechem, Abraham decided to build an altar to mark his arrival. And it is here that God says the words that will resonate through 2,000 years of history, right down to our modern day. To your offspring, I will give this land. Now, at this point, I should address a sensitive question, which is, was Abraham a historical figure or not? In my book, 10 Prayers That Changed the World, I answer that question with another question, which is, why should this be relevant? For us, yes, that is an important question, because we are living in a time when everything must be based on facts, on evidence, before we can accept it as truth. But in ancient times, truth had a very different meaning. These people did not have an internet or television or newspapers. They didn't have the ability to verify whether a story was factually true, and so they didn't particularly care. Instead, they had a different concept of truth, the truth of a story that had survived from generation to generation because of its accumulated wisdom, its experience, its values. We may call them legends today, but for the people in ancient times, these stories carried real meaning, a meaning that lent a tribe its history, its identity, its raison d'être. For these Hebrews, the story of Abraham was a living reality because it validated their faith in a single divine power, as compared to the mixed bag of deities that ruled nations far more powerful than their own. It took guts to do that. And the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob gave them that courage. And so, as scholars, we can debate the fact that Abraham and the patriarchs were probably literary constructs. But that doesn't take away the great moral truth of their stories. And that is what Genesis is after, to give us narratives that can resonate and inspire people for generations and centuries to come. And when you come down to it, it's a marvelous read, this story of Abraham. It has so many themes that will return time and again throughout the Judeo-Christian Bible. For example, there is the question of who will inherit Abraham's covenant with God, a theme that will return with the story of Jacob and Esau. We will also hear of the great famine that compels Abraham and his family to flee to Egypt, something that the sons of Jacob will do as well many, many years later. And then there's the theme of strife, of tensions within the clan that at times threatened to tear the tribal bonds apart. One such split took place when it became clear that Abraham's wells and pastures could no longer support his own herds as well as those of his nephew Lot. So he gave Lot a choice of his lands, and of course, Lot picked the best ones, the irrigated plains of Jordan, close to the Dead Sea. There he settled in a place called Sodom. Abraham eventually settled in Hebron, in the highlands of what today is called the West Bank. But then, says Genesis, it came to God's attention that evil things were happening in the plain of Jordan, north of the Dead Sea. Particularly in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, men were doing unspeakable things. God decided to wipe out this evil, just as he had destroyed the wickedness of humankind with a flood. Abraham immediately feared for Lot and his family living in Sodom. He intervened with God to save them, and God agreed. Angels bundled Lot and his family out of the city before God rained down sulfur and fire from heaven. Both Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. But on the way, Lot's wife could not contain her curiosity and looked back. And in that instant, says Genesis, she became a pillar of salt. As in the case of the Great Flood, archaeologists have searched for evidence of this great cataclysm. One theory holds that the cities were destroyed by a great earthquake, somewhere between 2100 and 1900 BC. In 2013, Stephen Collins of Trinity Southwest University argued that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was inspired by the impact of a massive meteor. Whatever the case may be, the shores of the Dead Sea are still covered with salt to this day.
And so we have there a comparison of the characters of Lot and Abraham. And we see that Abraham turns to God and is protective and caring about the people around him. He shows his great faith in God. So let's move on to chapter 22. This is a story that is often told, and we have a hard time understanding it, but I want to remind you to think back to what we learned when we looked at the book of Leviticus, when we studied about Cain and Abel, so that you can realize that there are some things happening in this story that we know the laws that were in place at the time would help you understand the story. So in chapter 22, it is written, sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God said, yes, he replied, here I am. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. And here we have a classic depiction of that. The firstborn son of every womb, human or animal, belongs to Yahweh. Abraham's faith is being tested here. In Exodus 13:13, we also read that you must buy back a son. Leviticus 20, verses 2 through 5, directly forbids child sacrifice. This story is about the test of faith and would Abraham follow through. So we must remember to use our ancient eyes as we're looking at this story. It is not so much about sacrifice as it is about the test of Abraham, fulfillment of Abraham's life cycle of faith. Genesis chapters 12 through 22 is the culmination of Abraham's spiritual odyssey. God first speaks to Abram in chapter 12. The story follows the challenges and fulfillment of promises during his lifetime. Following this event, called the binding of Isaac, God does not speak to Abraham directly again. This was the final spiritual test for Abraham. And so now his role is changed to become the role model of a life of faith to the Hebrew people. So this is the fulfillment of Abraham's life plan. Sarah and Abraham, of course, lived to be quite old. And when their death came, this is what it says in Genesis. Chapter 3, we read of the death and burial of Sarah. First, Sarah negotiates with Hittites for a plot of land that will become a burial place for his wife, himself, and future generations. The importance lies in the choice of the site itself. It is in the land of Canaan, which is the future promised land. So even though some generations will pass before the promise of this land comes to be fulfilled, this is an important signal to the readers of the story or hearers of the story in Genesis that the promise will continue. In chapter 23, verses 17 and 18, it summarizes the transaction. And the narrator of the story specifies that the entire plot of land, field, cave, trees, is deeded to Abraham in the presence of the Hittites, who have been witness to all that has transpired. This might seem odd to us because we think if we buy a piece of land, whatever is on that land is ours to come with it. But this was not necessarily true in ancient times. Someone could sell, for example, an olive grove to someone who was living on their land. They would still own the land, but the person could buy the trees. It's an oddity to our way of thinking, but not to an ancient Eastern Hemisphere world. So in doing this, I think what they're saying is this land we're purchasing, this little plot of land, it's like we now have 1 foot in Canaan. It's planted here. It's solidly planted here because we have a piece of land with everything that can be on it. A cave which is in it, a field which is on it, and trees which are on it. We have purchased all of it in its entirety. I'll go on to the death of Abraham. Abraham, after Sarah died, Abraham married another wife whose name was Keturah. She gave birth to 6 sons, and they became the ancestors of some of the tribes that come to live in the area. And they are all descendants of Abraham through this second wife of Keturah. In Genesis 25, we read that Abraham gave everything that he owned to his son Isaac. So that is who he chose to be his inheritor. Remember that Ishmael is the oldest son, but Isaac is actually the second son. And then we know that we have other sons through his second wife. And now we're also learning in verse 6 that before he died, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them off to a land in the east away from Isaac. So there were even more children from concubines, not just his first wife, Sarah, and his second wife, Keturah. So Abraham did have many descendants. And it says that Abraham lived to 175 years and he died at a ripe old age, having lived a long and satisfying life. He breathed his last and he joined his ancestors in death. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Melphah near Manor in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. This was the field Abraham had purchased from the Hittites and where he had buried his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who settled near Beer-Lahai Roi in the Negev. Now, I think it's interesting that there must have been contact between Isaac and Ishmael, even though Ishmael had been sent away, because he knew of his father's death. And they came together to bury him. So now Isaac is the next patriarch. He is the next in line to be progenitor of the Hebrews, Israelites. So I want to share a little flashback here with you. In Genesis 16, we see that Hagar used another name for the Lord when she was taken away from or sent away by Sarah into the wilderness when she was pregnant with Ishmael. Then she says, we used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. And she said, "You are the God who sees me." She also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" So that well was named Beer-Lahai Roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. Now, that's at the time this was written, of course. So I kind of skipped some of these slides. So let's go back here. We learned that he had more children. We learned that he was buried in the cave next to his wife that he had previously purchased for a burial for the family. And after Abraham's death, God blessed Isaac, and Isaac settled near Beer-Lahai Roy in the Negev, which is a flashback to the story of Hagar in Genesis chapter 16, as I just related. And so our first patriarch, Abraham, is buried now. And so we will continue the story with chapters 25 through 36 with Isaac, and then Esau and Jacob, who are the twin sons of Isaac. So focus on chapters 25 through 36 for the next 2 weeks. Have a great week, and I'll see you for lesson 6 next week.